On the morning Eileen ni Chile finally decided to take her first holiday in 40 years, the sky over Galway hung pale and still, as though it too was holding its breath. Her suitcase stood closed by the door, the tea still warm on the table, and her grandson's note stuck to the fridge read, "Safe travels, Nana." But the sound of the mobile vibrating on the counter sliced through the air with a strangeness she felt deep in her bones. On the screen, an unknown number. Just one sentence. "Don't fly. Go back home. Check on your husband." At first she thought it was a prank. Then she realized that fear had a voice, and it was her own, whispering low, "Something is terribly wrong." She tried to push the thought away. The taxi was already waiting outside, the driver impatiently tapping the steering wheel. But as she tucked her passport into her bag, she noticed that Declan's wedding ring, her husband's ring, was no longer on the bedside table where he left it every single night. A cold current ran up the back of her neck. With each step towards the door, her body grew heavier as if the floor itself was calling her back. When she finally touched the door handle, the phone vibrated again. The same message, identical, sent at exactly 0807, the time Declan always rang to say, "Mind yourself, Mo Gra," before work. Her heart lurched out of rhythm. She canceled the taxi. The driver muttered something under his breath, but she didn't hear. She walked back inside, sat on the edge of the bed and rang her husband. No answer. She rang again, and again. Only the hollow sound of silence. She opened the drawer, his wallet still there, but not his watch. For the first time, the house seemed to have heard something she hadn't. Eileen grabbed her coat, locked the door, and told herself she was just going to make sure everything was all right. But as she crossed the street, she looked towards the sea and thought, what if I'm already too late? The air tasted of salt and iron. Galway mornings always did, but today it felt heavier, like the wind carried something unspoken. She walked quickly, her boots clicking against the damp pavement, her breath forming clouds in the cold. The neighbors' curtains twitched as she passed, but no one came out. No one ever did in Claddagh when trouble stirred. They knew better than to ask questions that might demand answers. Her mind raced faster than her feet. Who would send such a message? And how did they know she was about to leave? The thought gnawed at her. She'd told no one except her grandson, and he was in Dublin hours away. Declan knew, of course, but Declan couldn't have sent it. He'd been so pleased for her, insisting she deserved the break, that he'd managed just fine on his own for a week. "You've earned it, love," he'd said, kissing her forehead the night before. "Go. Be free for once." But now, walking towards their small terraced house near the old quay, Eileen felt anything but free. She felt like a woman walking towards the edge of something dark and deep, something that once seen could never be unseen. The seagulls cried overhead, their voices sharp and accusing. The morning felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. When she reached the house, she stopped. The front door was slightly ajar. Not wide open, but enough. Enough to know that someone had either left in a hurry or hadn't left at all. Her pulse quickened. She pushed the door gently, and it swung inward with a low creak. The hallway was dim, the air inside colder than it should have been. "Declan?" she called, her voice breaking slightly. No answer. Only the rhythmic drip of the kitchen tap, slow and deliberate. Like a countdown. She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The house smelled different. Not bad, just unfamiliar. Like someone else had been there. She moved towards the kitchen, her heart pounding in her ears. On the table sat 2 teacups, both half full. One had a smudge of red lipstick on the rim. Eileen never wore red. She never wore lipstick at all. Her hand trembled as she picked up the cup, turning it slowly in the pale morning light. The lipstick was fresh. Whoever had been here hadn't been gone long. On the back of the chair hung a floral scarf. Silk, delicate, expensive looking. Not hers. Eileen's chest tightened. She set the cup down carefully, as though it might shatter, and walked towards the sitting room. Everything looked normal. The cushions in place, the photographs on the mantel undisturbed. But there was an energy in the room, a residue of something recent and unsettling. Her eyes landed on Declan's old computer, still open on the desk near the piano. The screen glowed faintly. She approached it slowly, her breath shallow. The cursor blinked over a paused video. Her finger hovered over the trackpad. She clicked. The video began to play. And there he was, Declan, alone, sitting in this very room, his face wet with tears. He was staring at something in his hands. The camera angle shifted slightly, and Eileen saw what it was. A framed photograph. Not of her, not of their wedding day, but of her first husband, the man she'd lost 30 years ago, the man whose death had nearly destroyed her. Declan was crying over him. The scream caught in her throat. She paused the video, stepped back, then back again, her mind spinning, trying to make sense of what she'd just seen. "What are you hiding from me, Declan?" she whispered, but only the wind outside answered, rattling the windows like it wanted in. She tried to breathe, but something inside her chest was pushing against the air, squeezing it out. In the corner of the screen, she saw the timestamp. The video had been recorded in the early hours of that very morning. She closed the laptop with shaking hands and stared at the old kettle on the stove. The same one Declan fixed every morning. The one he refused to replace no matter how many times she suggested it. A sound upstairs made her freeze. A creak. Slow. Deliberate. Someone was still in the house. The street was damp and the wind carried the smell of salt and rust from the Clado harbor. Eileen knew this path with her eyes closed, but she'd never seen it this silent. The neighbor's curtains trembled in the breeze. No one watched her pass. When she reached the door, she noticed the latch was scratched, and the lock open. Her heart raced. She pushed the door slowly and felt the cold from within, that cold that doesn't come from the weather, but from absence. "Declan?" she called, her voice faltering. No answer, only the rhythmic sound of the tap dripping in the sink. The tension came like a breath. Something was out of place. The kitchen radio was on, but playing static. In the hallway, 2 teacups on the table, one of them with lipstick, red, a color Eileen never wore. On the sofa, a floral scarf, not hers. And on the old piano, Declan's computer, open, the screen lit. The cursor blinked over a paused video. She hesitated, but clicked. The image began to move. Declan, alone, crying in front of a portrait, the portrait of her first husband, who died 30 years ago. The scream stuck in her throat. She paused the video, stepped back once, then again. "What are you hiding from me, Declan?" she whispered, but only the wind answered. She tried to breathe, but something inside her seemed to push against the air. In the corner of the screen, she saw the date. The video had been recorded in the early hours of the previous night. She turned off the monitor, rested her trembling hands on the table, and looked at the rusted kettle on the stove, the same one Declan fixed every morning. A noise upstairs made her freeze. Someone was still in the house. She climbed the stairs slowly, the floorboards creaking as if betraying her presence. The bedroom was empty, but the duvet was crumpled. On the bedside table, his wristwatch, stopped at 3:17. On the window, fingerprints on the glass. Eileen ran to the back garden. Nothing. The fear began to transform into anger. She left through the back door and went next door. The old neighbor, Patrick O'Riane, opened with a nervous expression, holding the newspaper upside down. "Did you see Declan this morning?" Eileen asked. He stammered. I heard noise late at night, but I thought it was wind." She noticed the sweat on his forehead despite the biting cold. His gaze kept shifting. "Patrick, tell me the truth. Who was here yesterday?" He lowered his head. "There was a woman. She left before dawn. I thought it best not to get involved." Eileen stepped back. "A woman?" "Yes, but she looked ill. She wore a scarf on her head. I swear I thought she was a relative of his." Eileen staggered. An ill woman? Scarf? The image from the video returned to her mind. The portrait, the tears. "Did she leave anything?" she asked. Patrick hesitated, then handed her a yellowed envelope. "I found this on your gate when I went out this morning." Inside, a folded paper with shaky handwriting. It wasn't betrayal. It was a promise. The words burned in her mind. A promise? To whom? She went back home, the wind stinging her eyes. She sat at the table, opened the envelope again, trying to decipher the handwriting. The signature was smudged, but she recognized the initials. N.M. Noreen. That name sounded distant, almost forgotten. A woman her husband had mentioned once as a former nurse at the local care home. Eileen felt the ground open beneath her feet. The kettle on the stove made a crack, as if demanding attention. She stood slowly, opened the lid, and inside it, wrapped in plastic, there was another letter, sealed with red wax. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped it. The kettle was old, battered, something Declan had insisted on keeping despite its dents and discoloration. "It still works, love," he'd say every time she suggested replacing it. "No point wasting what's not broken." But now, staring at the sealed letter hidden inside, Eileen understood. It wasn't sentiment. It was secrecy. He'd hidden this where he knew she'd never look, inside the one object she'd stopped touching years ago. Tired of scalding her fingers on its faulty handle, she peeled away the wax carefully, her breath shallow and uneven. The paper inside was brittle. The ink faded in places, but the words were legible. The handwriting was different from the first letter, steadier, older, written with the careful precision of someone who knew this might be their last chance to speak. Eileen unfolded it fully and read the first line. Her knees buckled. She had to sit down. The letter began with an apology, not for betrayal but for silence. It spoke of a child born in shame, given away in secrecy, and a love that had been buried under years of guilt and fear. It spoke of a man, her first husband, who had loved a woman named Noreen before he ever met Eileen. A woman who had borne his child and then disappeared, taking the secret with her. And it spoke of Declan, not as the man she'd married 20 years ago, but as the son that first love had produced. The son her first husband never knew existed. The son who had, impossibly, come back into her life, not as a stranger, but as the man she'd chosen to love again. Eileen's vision blurred. The room spun. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to anchor herself, but the ground kept shifting. Declan wasn't just her second husband. He was the son of her first, the child of the man she'd mourned for 3 decades. And he'd known. He'd known all along. She felt sick, not from disgust, but from the weight of it, the cruelty of fate, the unbearable intimacy of a truth that should never have been possible. She forced herself to keep reading. The letter explained how Noreen had tracked Declan down years ago, how she'd told him the truth about his parentage, and how he'd struggled with whether to tell Eileen. "I loved you before I knew who you were," the letter said in Declan's handwriting now replacing Noreen's. "And when I found out, I should have walked away. But I couldn't, because loving you felt like the only honest thing I'd ever done, even if it was built on a lie." Tears fell onto the page, smudging the ink further. Eileen clutched the letter to her chest and sobbed, deep, guttural sobs that came from a place she didn't know existed. Everything she thought she'd known about her life, her love, her choices, it was all a lie. Or worse, it was all true in the most horrifying way possible. She didn't know which hurt more. Outside, the wind howled. The house felt smaller, suffocating. She stood, still holding the letter, and walked to the window. The sea beyond the rooftops was gray and restless, waves crashing against the harbor wall with the same relentless rhythm as her heartbeat. Somewhere out there, Declan was hiding, or running, or worse. And whoever had sent that message knew exactly where he was and exactly what Eileen would find. Her mobile buzzed on the table. She turned, staring at it as if it were a living thing. Another message, same unknown number. This time, just 4 words. "Don't tell anyone, or he dies." She climbed the stairs slowly, the floorboards groaning beneath her weight as if announcing her presence to whoever, or whatever, waited above. The bedroom was empty, but the duvet lay twisted and pulled aside as though someone had left in haste. On the bedside table sat Declan's wristwatch, its hands frozen at 3:17. On the window, smudges of fingerprints marked the glass, still visible in the gray morning light. Eileen rushed to the back garden. Nothing. No footprints in the damp grass, no sign of disturbance. The fear that had gripped her began to shift, hardening into something sharper. Anger. She left through the back door and headed next door. The old neighbor, Patrick O'Riane, answered with a face drained of color, clutching the morning paper upside down in his gnarled hands. His eyes darted past her, as though checking to see if anyone else was watching. "Did you see Declan this morning?" Eileen asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Patrick stuttered. I heard noise late last night, but I thought it was, just the wind. You know how it gets." She noticed the beads of sweat on his forehead despite the cold that bit through her coat. His gaze wouldn't settle. It skittered away from hers, landing on the doorframe, the pavement, anywhere but her face. "Patrick," she said, her tone dropping, "tell me the truth. Who was here yesterday?" He lowered his head like a child caught in a lie. "There was a woman," he admitted quietly. "She left before dawn. I thought it best not to get involved, Eileen. You know how it is. Eileen felt the ground tilt beneath her. A woman? Her voice cracked. Yes, but she looked unwell. Wore a scarf over her head. I swear to you, I thought she was family. A cousin, maybe, or a sister. Eileen staggered back a step, gripping the doorframe for support. An ill woman. A scarf. The image from the video flashed through her mind again. Declan's tears. The portrait of her first husband. The anguish carved into his face. Did she leave anything? She asked, barely able to form the words. Patrick hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as though afraid someone might overhear. Then he reached into his cardigan pocket and pulled out a yellowed envelope, its edges soft with age. I found this on your gate when I went out this morning, he said, pressing it into her hands. I didn't open it. Wasn't my place. Eileen took the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully, the handwriting shaky and uneven, as though written by someone whose hands could barely hold the pen. The words were brief, but devastating. It wasn't betrayal. It was a promise. No signature. No explanation. Just that single, cryptic sentence that felt like both an accusation and an absolution. Eileen read it again, then again, willing the words to make sense, but they only deepened the pit opening in her stomach. A promise. To whom? For what? The letter trembled in her grip. She looked up at Patrick, who was watching her with something like pity in his rheumy eyes. Do you know who she was? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He shook his head. Never seen her before in my life. But she moved slow, Eileen. Like every step hurt, and she kept looking back at your house, like she was afraid to leave but more afraid to stay. Eileen turned away without another word, the envelope clutched to her chest. The wind stung her eyes as she walked back across the narrow lane separating their houses. Her mind raced, trying to piece together fragments that refused to fit. A sick woman. A scarf. A promise. Declan's tears. The portrait. It was like looking at a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing and the other half from a different box entirely. Back inside her house, she sat heavily at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd eaten breakfast with Declan just yesterday morning, where he'd kissed her cheek and told her to enjoy her holiday, that she deserved it. She opened the envelope again, smoothing out the creases in the paper, searching for something, anything she might have missed. The handwriting was old-fashioned, the letters formed with care despite their shakiness, and then she saw it, at the very bottom of the page, so faint she'd nearly overlooked it. 2 initials, barely legible. N.M. Noreen. The name surfaced from the depths of her memory like something dredged up from the seabed. Noreen McGrath. A woman Declan had mentioned once, years ago in passing. An old nurse from St. Finbarr's care home, he'd said. Someone who'd helped him when he was younger, though he'd never elaborated on how or why. Eileen had never thought to ask. Why would she? It had seemed so inconsequential at the time, just another name in the long list of people who'd touched their lives and moved on. But now, staring at those initials, she felt the floor drop away beneath her. Noreen. A promise. Her first husband. Declan's tears. The pieces weren't fitting together. They were colliding, creating something monstrous and inevitable. Eileen stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She needed air. She needed space. She needed the kettle. Her eyes landed on it, sitting innocuously on the stove where it always did, its surface tarnished and dented from years of use. Declan's kettle, the one he refused to replace no matter how many times she complained about its broken handle and uneven spout. She'd stopped using it years ago, but he never had. Every morning, without fail, he'd fill it and set it to boil, making his tea in the same ritual he'd performed for as long as she'd known him. Something pulled her towards it. She crossed the kitchen slowly, as though approaching something dangerous. When she reached the stove, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the lid. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, she lifted it. Inside, wrapped carefully in plastic to protect it from the water and steam, was another envelope. This one sealed with red wax, the kind used for important documents, for things meant to last. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pulled it free, the plastic crinkling in her shaking hands. The seal bore no crest, no marking, just smooth red wax, unbroken. Eileen stared at it for a long moment, knowing that once she broke it, there would be no going back. Whatever Declan had hidden here, whatever truth he'd sealed away in this battered old kettle, It would change everything. She could feel it in her bones, in the cold sweat prickling her skin, in the way her breath came short and shallow. With a decisive movement, she broke the seal. The letter smelled of rust and steam, the paper soft and fragile in her hands. Eileen broke the seal with trembling fingers, unfolding it carefully as though it might disintegrate at her touch. The ink was faded in places, smudged by time or tears. She couldn't tell which, but the first few lines were clear enough, and they were enough to steal the breath from her lungs. If you're reading this, it's because I couldn't tell you whilst I was still alive. I didn't betray you, but I also didn't tell you who I truly am. Her vision blurred. She blinked hard, forcing herself to focus, to keep reading even as her hands shook so violently the paper rustled like autumn leaves. The second paragraph brought the tension to an unbearable pitch. When we met, you knew only that I came from Cork, but I left out the rest. Noreen, the woman who works at St. Finbar's care home, is more than a friend from my past. She's the woman who brought me into this world. And the man in the portrait, your first husband, was the one who loved her and lost her. I'm the son she gave up for adoption, Eileen. I'm his son. The floor disappeared beneath her. Everything that had been solid, the marriage, the home, the love, turned to echo. Declan wasn't just her second husband. He was the lost son of her first, the child she'd never known existed, the child of a man she'd mourned for 30 years, whose grave she still visited on his birthday, whose memory she'd carried like a stone in her chest through decades of grief and eventual healing. And she'd married that man's son. She'd shared a bed with him. She'd loved him. She'd built a life with him. The room tilted. Eileen dropped the letter, stumbled to the sofa, and collapsed onto it, her mind screaming but her body refusing to react. She tried to make sense of it, to find some angle from which this nightmare might look less horrific, but there was none. The mathematics of it were simple and devastating. She had loved two men, and they were father and son. She hadn't known, but did not knowing make it less wrong? Did innocence erase the violation of something so fundamental, so sacred? Outside, the church bells tolled 6 times, each chime resonating through the still air like a judgment. Eileen looked towards the window and saw her own reflection in the glass, pale, motionless, wearing the face of someone who'd learned too much and could never unlearn it. Her mobile buzzed on the table, the vibration loud in the silence. She didn't want to look, didn't want to see, but her hand reached for it anyway, moving of its own accord. A new number, a new message. This time, just one line. Don't tell anyone, or he dies. The words glowed on the screen, stark and cold. Eileen's breath caught. Someone was watching. Someone knew she'd found the letter. Someone knew everything. She set the phone down carefully, as though it might explode, and looked around the room. The curtains were drawn, the door locked, but the feeling of being observed crawled across her skin like insects. Who was out there, and what did they want? She picked up the letter again, forcing herself to read the rest. Declan's handwriting continued, more hurried now, as though he'd been writing against time. I discovered the truth 5 years after we married. Noreen found me. She was dying, or thought she was, and wanted to meet me before the end. She told me about my father, about the love affair that produced me, about the shame that forced her to give me away. She showed me a photograph. It was him, your first husband, the man whose picture you kept on the mantel for years before you finally put it away. I recognized his eyes. They were mine. I should have told you then. I know that now, but I couldn't. How could I? How do you tell the woman you love that you're bound to her by a thread so twisted and wrong that it should never have existed? I thought about leaving. God knows I thought about it. I packed a bag 3 times, but every time I looked at you, I couldn't do it, because loving you was the only thing in my life that ever felt right, even if everything about it was wrong. Noreen begged me not to tell you. She said it would destroy you, and she was probably right, but keeping the secret has destroyed me instead. I wake every morning with the weight of it pressing down on my chest. I look at you across the breakfast table and think, she doesn't know. She loves me, and she doesn't know. And that lie sits between us like a third person in the room, invisible but always there. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for any of this. Sometimes I think the only reason I was born was to punish you for something you didn't do, for some cosmic debt I don't understand. And if that's true, then I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The letter ended there. No signature, no farewell. Just those words hanging in the air like smoke. Eileen folded the paper slowly, her movements mechanical, as though her body had disconnected from her mind. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean of everything she'd thought she was. Her marriage, her choices, her life, all of it built on a foundation that had never existed. She stood and walked to the mantelpiece, where she'd kept her first husband's photograph for years after his death. A young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, frozen forever at 32. She'd eventually put it away when she married Declan, not out of disrespect, but because it seemed right to leave the past behind. Now she wished she'd burned it, wished she'd never met either of them, wished she could rewind her life to a point before any of this had happened and choose a different path entirely. But you can't unknow what you know, you can't unfeel what you've felt, and you can't unlove someone just because the truth makes that love unbearable. The mobile buzzed again. Same number. Another message. Go to St. Finbar's. Noreen is waiting. She'll tell you the rest. But go alone. And tell no one. Eileen stared at the screen, her heart pounding. This was a trap. It had to be. But what choice did she have? Declan was out there somewhere, possibly in danger, possibly already. No, she couldn't think that. Wouldn't. She grabbed her coat, shoved the letter into her pocket, and headed for the door. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the sea. The streets were empty, the gray sky pressing down like a lid. Eileen walked quickly, her footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. St. Finbar's was only a mile away, but it felt like crossing into another country. With every step, she felt herself moving further from the life she'd known, and closer to something darker, something she couldn't yet see but could feel waiting for her like a mouth opened wide. The cold inside the house grew deeper, as though the air itself carried memories. Eileen clutched her mobile with trembling hands, reading and rereading the message. Don't tell anyone, or he dies. The fear that had been formless before now had weight, texture, presence. Who was watching her? The street outside was empty, but the wind whistled through the cracks in the window frames with a sound that resembled voices. She closed the curtains and tucked the letter into the drawer of the china cabinet, alongside the photograph of her first husband. Only then did she notice the detail she'd missed before. The portrait had been signed. In the lower corner, a date, 1987, the same year Noreen had given birth to the lost son. The signature, in delicate letters, read F.O. Kurnine, the name of the artist who'd painted the frescoes in the old St. Finbar's church, demolished decades ago. Declan had been born in that neighborhood. The coincidence cut like a blade. The following day, she went to the care home. The building sat at the edge of town, gray stone and narrow windows surrounded by bare trees that clawed at the sky. Inside, the smell of boiled vegetables and antiseptic hung heavy in the air. Noreen was there, thin as a whisper, a pale blue scarf covering her head, seated near the window overlooking the courtyard. When Eileen introduced herself, the woman's eyes filled with tears before a single word was spoken. He told you, didn't he? Noreen asked, her voice hoarse and breaking. Not everything, Eileen replied, her throat tight. Only enough to destroy me. The woman smiled, a sad, weathered smile that seemed to carry the weight of decades. Destroy? No, free. He never wanted to hurt you. He only wanted to give back to your heart what fate had stolen. Eileen didn't understand. Give back what? Noreen pointed towards the corridor with a frail, shaking hand. The love you lost. The man in the portrait. He was my love too. And his father. The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward, disturbing everything. Before Eileen could respond, a nurse entered, announcing that Noreen needed to rest. Eileen left in silence, crossing the garden strewn with damp leaves. When she looked back, Noreen stood at the window, watching her with the same gaze of someone who already knew the ending. At home, she found the neighbor Patrick waiting at her door, pale and agitated. You need to see this, Eileen. He handed her a brown envelope, his hands shaking. Inside was a USB drive and a note written in unsteady letters. If anything happens to me, show her this. And on the reverse, just one word. Declan. Eileen's heart hammered. She invited Patrick inside, though she wasn't sure she wanted company. But the thought of watching whatever was on that drive alone felt unbearable. She plugged the USB into Declan's old laptop, The same one where she'd found the first video. The screen flickered to life, and there he was again. Declan sitting at the kitchen table, the very table where she now sat. His face was drawn, eyes red-rimmed, as though he'd been crying for hours. He took a deep breath before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you're watching this, it means I didn't come back. It means something's happened, and I need you to know the truth. All of it." Patrick shifted uncomfortably beside her, but Eileen didn't take her eyes off the screen. Declan continued, "I grew up believing the woman who gave birth to me had abandoned me, that I was unwanted, unloved. It wasn't until Noreen found me, years later, that I learned the truth. She didn't abandon me. She gave me away to protect you. Because the man she loved, the man who fathered me, was your husband. Your first husband. The one you mourned. The one you never stopped loving. Not really." Eileen's breath caught. She wanted to look away but couldn't. Declan's image on the screen seemed to be speaking directly to her soul. "When I met you, fate played the cruelest trick imaginable. I should have walked away. I knew I should. But I couldn't. It wasn't desire, Eileen. It was recognition. As though my heart had known you before I ever did. As though I was meant to find you even if finding you was the worst thing I could have done." He leaned closer to the camera, his voice dropping even lower. "The man who sent you that message, the benefactor everyone in this town reveres, he wants to keep everything buried. He was the one who covered up your first husband's death. It wasn't an accident, Eileen. It was never an accident. He knew. And now he's terrified, I'll tell. Terrified the truth will come out and destroy everything he's built." Eileen's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled sound escaping her throat. Patrick reached out as though to steady her, but she waved him away, her eyes fixed on the screen. Declan's face twisted with pain. "Noreen tried to warn you. She knew he'd do anything to keep the secret buried. If something happens to me, she'll carry the guilt in her eyes. But the sin is his. And maybe mine too, for loving you the wrong way." The video ended with the sound of footsteps in the background. Declan's head jerked towards the noise, his eyes wide with fear. Then the screen went black. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Eileen closed the laptop slowly, her hands numb. Patrick said nothing, his face ashen. Outside, the Galway sky opened, releasing a gray drizzle that tapped against the windows like impatient fingers. Eileen stood, her legs unsteady. She grabbed her coat, shoved the USB drive into her pocket, and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Patrick called after her, but she didn't answer. She already knew. There was only one place left to go, one person left to confront. The man Declan had mentioned, the benefactor, the pillar of the community, the one who held the threads of so many lives in his carefully manicured hands. Patrick Fennelly, president of the St. Finbarr's Care Home Council. Respected, untouchable, and if Declan was telling the truth, a murderer. The church loomed ahead, its spire cutting through the mist. Eileen pushed through the heavy wooden doors and found him there, kneeling in the front pew, hands clasped in prayer. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual mask of calm authority. "Eileen," he said, rising slowly, "I've been expecting you." His voice was smooth, controlled, but she could hear the tension beneath it. "You know then?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He smiled, a thin, humorless smile. "I know many things. The question is, what are you going to do with what you know?" She stepped closer, her heart pounding but her gaze unwavering. "I'm going to find my husband, and then I'm going to make sure the truth comes out. All of it." Patrick's smile faded. "The truth," he said softly, "is a dangerous thing, Eileen. It doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it just burns everything to the ground." He gestured to the pew beside him. "Sit. Let's talk. There are things you need to understand before you make decisions you can't take back." Eileen hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to run. But she sat, because if there was even a chance, however small, that he knew where Declan was, she had to take it. Patrick folded his hands in his lap, his expression unreadable. "Your husband," he began, "is a good man, but he doesn't understand the delicate balance that holds communities like ours together. Some truths are better left buried, not out of malice, but out of mercy." Eileen connected the USB drive to the computer with trembling hands. The video began without sound, showing Declan seated at the kitchen table, the same table where she now found herself. He took a deep breath before speaking, his voice breaking. "If you're watching this, it's because I didn't return. I didn't betray you, Eileen. But I lied about who I was." His voice faltered, his eyes brimming with tears. "I grew up believing the woman who gave birth to me had abandoned me. Only later did I discover that she did it to protect you, because the man she loved was your husband. When I met you, fate played its cruelest trick. I should have left, but I couldn't. It wasn't desire. It was recognition, as though my heart already knew you." The tension mounted when he leaned towards the camera. The man who sent the message, the benefactor everyone reveres, wants to keep everything buried. He was the one who covered up your first husband's death. It wasn't an accident, he knew. And now he fears I'll tell. Eileen pressed her hand to her mouth, her body frozen. Declan continued. "Noreen tried to warn you. She knew he'd do anything to silence the truth. If something happens to me, she'll carry the guilt in her eyes, but the sin is his, and perhaps mine, for loving you the wrong way." The video ended with the sound of footsteps in the background. Declan glanced to the side, frightened, and the screen went black. Eileen closed the laptop and began to weep as she hadn't wept in years. Outside, Galway's sky opened into pale gray. Each raindrop struck the glass as though pleading for haste. She grabbed her coat, tucked the USB drive into her pocket, and headed to the church where she knew she'd find the benefactor, Padraig Fennelly, a man with an impassive face and steady hands, president of the St. Finbarr's Care Home Council. When she saw him, he smiled with forced calm. "You know then," he said. "If everyone knew, what would change? There are sins that hold the world together," Eileen replied in a low voice, "or make it collapse." Padraig poured 2 glasses of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. "Declan was a good lad," he said, his voice steady, but with something lurking beneath, something that might have been fear, or regret, or both. But he didn't know when to keep quiet. His eyes met hers, cold and calculating. Eileen remained standing, refusing the drink, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her cooperation. "What did you do to my husband?" she asked, her voice like steel. He gave a slight smile, more grimace than grin. Nothing that time wasn't already doing to him. He wanted justice, but there are names that cannot fall. Not now, not ever. Eileen stepped closer, her shadow falling across him. "You killed the man I loved, and you killed the son he left behind." "Why?" Padraig lifted the glass to his lips but didn't drink. "Because the truth doesn't fit into people's faith. They need heroes, not sinners. They need stories that comfort them, not truths that destroy them." The sound of footsteps echoed in the church nave. Someone was approaching. It was Patrick, the neighbor, entering breathless, carrying a letter in his hands. "She's gone, Eileen. Noreen died this morning, but she left this." The letter was addressed to Eileen. The lines, shaky and faint. "Forgive me. I protected the lie because the love we felt condemned us. Don't let the blood of the innocent sustain the faith of the guilty." Tears fell onto the paper, smudging the ink further. Padraig stood, his voice now grave. "Give that to the Garda, and you'll ruin everything that remains of this town. Choose, justice or peace." The dilemma tore through Eileen like a blade. What value did truth have if it left only ruins in its wake? She tucked the letter into her pocket and walked towards the door. Outside, the sea roared against the harbor wall. She turned one last time to Padraig and said, "Silence kills too, Father." He lowered his eyes, defeated. As Eileen stepped out into the rain, the church bells began to toll, 6 long, mournful chimes. On the horizon, an ambulance was heading towards the care home. Inside it, a nurse held a mobile in her hands, the screen illuminated. Eileen recognized the number displayed, the same one that had sent the first message. She stood frozen on the church steps, rain soaking through her coat, watching the ambulance's lights disappear into the gray distance. The pieces were falling into place now, slowly, painfully, like shards of broken glass being pressed back together. The nurse, the messages, the warning. Someone at St. Finbarr's had been trying to help her, or trying to control what she discovered. Either way, Noreen's death changed everything. Eileen pulled out her mobile and stared at the screen. No new messages, just the old ones, glowing like accusations. She scrolled back through them, reading each one again with fresh eyes. Don't fly, go back home. Check on your husband. Don't tell anyone, or he dies. Go to St. Finbar's. Noreen is waiting. Each one had been a breadcrumb, leading her deeper into a maze she was only now beginning to understand. Patrick caught up with her, huffing from the exertion, his face red and slick with rain. "What are you going to do?" he asked, gripping her arm. She pulled away gently. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I need to find Declan. If he's still alive." Her voice broke. She couldn't finish the sentence. Patrick nodded, understanding. "I'll help you," he said. "Whatever you need." They walked back towards Eileen's house in silence, the rain falling harder now, drumming against the rooftops and running in rivers down the cobbled streets. When they reached her door, Eileen noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small mark scratched into the wood near the handle, fresh and deliberate. 3 lines crossing each other. A symbol. She'd seen it before. Years ago, in the old church before it was demolished. It was a warning, or a marker, or both. Someone had been here. Recently. She pushed the door open cautiously. The house was just as she'd left it, but something felt different. The air was disturbed, as though someone had passed through only moments before. On the kitchen table sat a small package wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. No note, no name, just the package. Eileen's heart raced as she approached it, Patrick hovering nervously behind her. "Should we call the Garda?" he whispered. She shook her head. "Not yet. I need to know what this is first." With careful hands, she untied the string and peeled back the paper. Inside was a wooden box, old and worn, with a brass clasp. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a ring, a man's wedding band, tarnished with age. And beneath it, a photograph. Not of Declan, but of her first husband, young and smiling, standing beside a woman Eileen didn't recognize at first. Then she looked closer. The woman's eyes, the shape of her face. It was Noreen, decades younger but unmistakably her, and they were holding hands. Eileen's breath caught. On the back of the photograph, written in ink now faded to brown, "Before everything fell apart, before the lie, before the promise," and a date, June 1986, 1 year before Declan was born, 1 year before her first husband died, or didn't die. Suddenly, nothing made sense again. If the photograph was from 1986, and her husband had died in 1987, then her mobile buzzed. She jumped, nearly dropping it. Another message. Same unknown number, but this time just 2 words. "He's alive." Patrick poured 2 glasses of whiskey, the liquid catching the faint light from the stained glass windows. "Declan was a good lad," he said, his voice firm but with something trembling beneath, something that resembled fear. But he didn't know when to stay silent. His eyes were cold, calculating. Eileen remained standing, her arms crossed. "What did you do to my husband?" Her voice was steel wrapped in ice. He smiled faintly. "Nothing that time wasn't already doing. He wanted justice, but there are names that cannot fall. Not now. Not ever." Eileen moved closer. "You killed the man I loved, and the son he left behind. Why?" Patrick lifted the glass to his mouth but didn't drink. "Because truth doesn't fit into people's faith. They need heroes, not sinners." The sound of footsteps echoed through the church. Someone was approaching. It was Patrick, entering out of breath, a letter clutched in his hands. "She's dead, Eileen. Noreen died this morning, but she left this for you." The letter was addressed to her. The lines were shaky, barely legible. "Forgive me. I protected the lie because the love we felt condemned us. Don't let the blood of the innocent sustain the faith of the guilty." Tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink further. Patrick stood, his voice now grave and heavy. "Hand that to the Garda, and you'll destroy everything that remains of this village. Choose, justice or peace." The dilemma cut through Eileen like a serrated blade. What value did truth have if it left only ashes and broken lives? She could feel the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders, the weight of secrets kept for the good of the community, of sins buried so that others could sleep soundly at night. But at what cost? How many lives had been twisted and broken to maintain the illusion of righteousness? She looked at Patrick, at his carefully composed face, and saw not a monster but something worse, a man who genuinely believed he'd done the right thing. She tucked the letter into her coat pocket and walked towards the door, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Outside, the sea roared, waves crashing against the harbor wall with furious intensity. She paused at the threshold and turned back one final time. "Silence kills too, Patrick," she said quietly. "You think you're protecting people, but you're just protecting yourself." He lowered his gaze, and for the first time, she saw him as he truly was. Not powerful, not righteous, just old and afraid and clinging desperately to a narrative that had long since crumbled to dust. As Eileen stepped out into the rain, the church bells began their mournful toll, 6 long, heavy chimes that seemed to carry across the entire town. In the distance, an ambulance was making its way towards St. Finbarr's care home, its lights cutting through the gray mist. Inside, a nurse clutched a mobile in her hands, the screen glowing. Eileen recognized the number displayed before the ambulance disappeared around a corner, the same one that had sent her the first message. Patrick caught up with her, panting. "What now?" he asked, rain streaming down his weathered face. Eileen didn't answer immediately. She stood in the middle of the street, letting the rain soak through her clothes, feeling the cold seep into her bones. Around her, Galway continued its daily rhythm. People hurrying home with shopping bags, cars splashing through puddles, the distant cry of seagulls. Life going on as though nothing had changed, as though the foundations of everything hadn't just shifted beneath their feet. "I need to find him," she finally said. "Declan, if there's even a chance he's still alive." Her voice broke, but she steadied herself. "I need to know the truth. All of it. Not Patrick's version, not Noreen's, not even Declan's. I need to see it for myself." Patrick nodded slowly. "Where do we start?" She thought for a moment, then remembered something from Declan's video. "The old church," she said. "The one they demolished. St. Finbarr's. Declan mentioned it was where his mother gave birth to him, where the artist who painted that portrait worked. If there are answers anywhere, they'll be there." "But it's gone," Patrick protested. "They tore it down 20 years ago, built flats on the site." Eileen shook her head. "The building's gone, but the records aren't. Churches keep everything. Baptismal records, confessions, correspondence. If Patrick was involved in covering up what happened to my first husband, there'll be evidence. Priests write everything down." She started walking, her pace quickening with new purpose. Patrick hurried to keep up. They made their way to the diocesan archives, housed in a converted warehouse near the docks. The building smelled of mildew and old paper, that peculiar scent of history slowly decaying. The archivist, a thin woman with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, looked up suspiciously as they entered, dripping rainwater onto her pristine floor. "We're closing soon," she announced. "I need to see the records from the old St. Finbarr's church," Eileen said, pulling off her soaked headscarf, "specifically from 1986 and 1987. The woman's expression shifted, something between curiosity and alarm. "Those records are sealed," she said carefully, "by order of the diocese." "By whose order specifically?" Eileen pressed. The archivist hesitated. "Bishop Fennelly, back when he was still a priest." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Patrick hadn't just been a participant, he'd orchestrated the entire cover-up from the beginning. He'd sealed the records, demolished the church, erased every trace of what had happened, and he'd risen through the ranks of the church on the foundation of that lie, becoming the respected community leader everyone revered. Eileen felt rage building in her chest, hot and righteous. "I need to see those records," she said, her voice dangerous. "Please, my husband's life depends on it." The archivist studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "I could lose my position for this," she murmured, but she was already moving towards the back room. She returned carrying a dusty box marked with faded ink, St. Finbarr's Parish, 1985-1990. "You have 20 minutes, she said. "That's all I can give you." Eileen nodded gratefully and carried the box to a reading table. Inside were ledgers, letters, administrative documents, the mundane bureaucracy of a small parish. But as Eileen dug deeper, she found something else. A journal, leather-bound and water-stained, its pages covered in tight, anxious handwriting. She opened it carefully. The first entry was dated March 1986. "She came to me in confession today, pregnant, terrified. She begged me not to tell, but I see now that silence makes me complicit. God forgive me for what I am about to do." Eileen's hand shook as she turned the pages. Entry after entry detailed Noreen's pregnancy, her desperation, her fear of the man she loved, Eileen's first husband, discovering the truth. But why? What was she so afraid of? The answer came several pages later, in an entry from November 1986. She told me tonight that he isn't the father, that she lied to him, let him believe the child was his, so he would leave his wife and come to her. But the real father is someone else, someone dangerous, someone who would kill them both if he knew. I tried to convince her to tell the truth, but she's terrified. She says the only way to protect everyone is to give the child away and disappear. I fear she may be right. God help us all. Eileen's vision blurred. Her first husband hadn't been Declan's father. The entire foundation of this nightmare had been a lie built on top of another lie. Noreen had lied to protect herself, and in doing so, had set in motion a chain of events that had destroyed multiple lives. But if Declan's real father wasn't Eileen's first husband, then who was it? She kept reading, her heart hammering, until she found the final entry, dated 2 weeks before her husband's death. Patrick came to see me today. He knows. I don't know how, but he knows everything. He says if I don't leave town immediately, he'll make sure everyone else knows too. He says he's protecting the church, but I think he's protecting himself. I'm afraid of what he might do. The journal ended there. No more entries. No resolution. But the implications were clear and devastating. Patrick had known all along. Known about Noreen's pregnancy. Known about the lies. Known about the real father. And somehow, Eileen's first husband had discovered the truth too, and died because of it. Whether it was truly an accident or something more sinister, she couldn't yet prove. But she knew. Deep in her bones, she knew. Patrick read over her shoulder, his face growing paler with each revelation. Jesus Christ, he whispered. What do we do with this? Eileen closed the journal carefully and looked at him. We find Declan, she said, and then we finish what he started. Noreen's funeral was small. Few attended. Eileen stood at the back, dressed in black, her face hidden beneath a veil. When the coffin was lowered into the ground, something in her chest opened, not in pain, but in understanding. After the ceremony, Patrick approached, carrying a brown envelope. This was found in her room, with your name on it. Eileen opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was an old photograph. Her, Noreen, and her first husband, standing side by side, smiling before the sea at Claddagh, long before any of them knew the weight destiny would place upon them. On the back, written in faded blue ink, "Forgive me, my daughter. Now you can fly." The wind tore the photograph from her hands and carried it towards the sea. Eileen ran to the cliff's edge, watching the image float and dance on the waves before disappearing into the gray water. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time, they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of release. She turned back towards the cemetery, towards the fresh mound of earth that held Noreen's remains, and felt something shift inside her, a weight she'd been carrying without knowing it, finally lifting. She walked back to her house slowly, deliberately, taking in every detail of the familiar streets as though seeing them for the first time. The harbor with its bobbing boats, the narrow lanes with their brightly painted doors, the gulls wheeling overhead, their cries sharp and free. This was her home. It had always been her home. But she'd been living in it as a ghost, haunted by the past, trapped by secrets and lies that weren't even hers to carry. Inside, she lit the fire and sat with the old kettle in her hands, feeling its weight, its dents and imperfections. She thought about Declan and how he'd clung to this useless object, fixing it every morning, refusing to let it go. Now she understood. It wasn't about the kettle. It was about holding on to something familiar when everything else was falling apart. It was about the small rituals that keep us tethered when we feel ourselves drifting away. Her mobile buzzed on the table. She picked it up, almost afraid to look. Another message from the unknown number. But this time it wasn't a warning or a threat. Just 3 words. Now you can fly. She stared at the screen for a long moment, then smiled. A tired, knowing smile. She understood now. The messages had never been from an enemy. They'd been from someone trying to help her, trying to guide her through the maze of lies to the truth on the other side. Someone who knew that sometimes you have to walk through fire to find your way home. She deleted the messages, all of them, and set the phone down. There would be no more looking back, no more searching for answers in the past. What was done, and the dead would have to bury their own dead. She had a life to live, and she'd wasted too much of it already on ghosts and regrets. 3 days later, a letter arrived, not by post, but by hand, slipped under her door in the early morning. She found it when she came down for breakfast, a simple white envelope with her name written in familiar handwriting. Her heart stopped. She knew that hand. She'd seen it 1,000 times. On shopping lists, birthday cards, notes left on the fridge. Declan's hand. With shaking fingers, she opened the envelope. Inside was a single page, covered in his neat script. "My darling Eileen, if you're reading this, then you know everything. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to tell you myself. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused, but I need you to know that everything I told you in that video was true. Except for one thing. Noreen wasn't my mother. Not by blood, anyway. She protected me, raised me, loved me when no one else would. But she wasn't the one who gave birth to me. Your first husband was my father, yes, but my mother. My mother was someone else entirely. Someone who couldn't keep me. Someone who gave me to Noreen to protect me from a man who would have killed me if he'd known I existed. That man was Patrick Fennelly. He's my biological father, Eileen. And he spent his entire life making sure no one ever found out." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She read on. "I know this doesn't make it right. I know loving you was still wrong. That marrying you was a betrayal of everything decent and good. But I want you to understand why I couldn't walk away. It wasn't just love, though. God knows I loved you. It was that for the first time in my life I felt like I belonged somewhere. With you, I wasn't the bastard son of a hypocrite and a frightened girl. I was just a man who loved a woman. And that feeling, however wrong, was the only true thing in my life." The letter continued. "I'm leaving Ireland. I have to. Padraig knows I have evidence. The journal, the records, everything. He'll come for me eventually, and I won't let him hurt you to get to me. Maybe someday, when enough time has passed, when the truth has come out and the dust has settled, we can see each other again. But for now, I need you to live, Eileen. Really live. Not just exist, not just survive, but fly. You've been grounded for so long by grief and duty and love for people who never deserved it. It's time to let go. I love you. I always will. But I love you enough to let you go. Declan." Eileen folded the letter carefully and held it to her chest. She sat there for a long time, watching the fire burn low, feeling the warmth seep into her bones. Outside, the morning brightened, the gray Galway sky giving way to pale gold. The gulls cried overhead, and somewhere in the distance she heard the church bells begin their morning call. 6 chimes, just as they'd always been. 6 chimes marking the hour, marking the passage of time, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She stood, placed the letter on the mantelpiece next to where her first husband's photograph used to sit, and walked to the window. The sea stretched out before her, vast and gray-green and infinite. She'd lived her entire life within sight of it, but she'd never really seen it before, never really understood what it meant, that endless horizon, that promise of something beyond, that invitation to leave the shore and venture into the unknown. For the first time in 40 years, Eileen ní Chile felt free. Free from the past, free from the lies, free from the weight of other people's sins. She picked up her mobile, scrolled through her contacts and found her grandson's number. "Book me that ticket," she texted. "I'm ready to fly." The response came back almost immediately. "About time, Nana, about bloody time." She smiled and set the phone down. Then she went upstairs, pulled out her suitcase, and began to pack. This time, nothing would stop her. This time, she was really leaving. And as she folded clothes and gathered toiletries, she thought about Noreen and Declan and her first husband, and all the tangled, tragic threads that had bound them together. She thought about Padraig and his desperate need to control the narrative, to be seen as righteous even as he committed unspeakable acts. She thought about the cost of silence, the price of secrets, and the way lies metastasize over time, spreading like cancer until they destroy everything they touch. But mostly, she thought about forgiveness, not the easy kind, the kind that excuses and forgets, but the hard kind, the kind that acknowledges the hurt and the betrayal and the wrong and then chooses to set it down anyway, to stop carrying it, to walk away unburdened. She forgave Declan for lying to her, for loving her despite knowing it was wrong. She forgave Noreen for the choices she'd made out of fear and desperation. She even forgave Padraig, though she knew he'd never forgive himself, would spend the rest of his life building monuments to his own righteousness, while the truth gnawed at him from within. And finally, quietly, in the privacy of her own heart, she forgave herself. For not seeing, for not knowing, for loving the wrong people in the wrong ways. For being human. For being flawed. For surviving. The following morning, she boarded a plane. Her grandson met her at the airport, grinning, pulling her into a fierce hug. "Where to first?" he asked. She thought for a moment, then smiled. "Somewhere I've never been," she said. "Somewhere new." As the plane lifted off, Eileen pressed her face to the window and watched Ireland shrink beneath her. The green fields, the gray stone walls, the glittering sea. Everything she'd known, everything she'd been, falling away. And she felt no sadness, only the dizzy, breathless exhilaration of flight. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it just shows you where the door is, but you still have to choose to walk through it. You still have to choose to leave the past behind and step into the unknown. And that choice, that brave, terrifying, beautiful choice, is what makes us human, what makes us whole. Eileen ni Chile had finally made that choice. And as the plane climbed higher, breaking through the clouds into brilliant sunshine, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, not for peace, but for the courage to keep flying, to never look back, to never let fear or guilt or grief pull her down to earth again. She was free, finally and possibly completely free, and nothing, not the past, not the truth, not even love itself, could cage her anymore.